Shall we?
Good morning, everyone. Please start taking your seats so that we can get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ali Aslan. I'm a Berlin-based international TV presenter and journalist, and I have the great pleasure of being your moderator throughout the next day. On behalf of the G20 Health and Development Partnership, it is indeed my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you all to the annual H20 Summit. For those who are here for the first time, the summit is an independent platform in support of the G20 presidency agendas and has been launched right here actually in Geneva in 2018 by the G20 Health and Development Partnership's global ambassadors and membership organizations. Each year, it is bringing together the global health community and other relevant stakeholders to discuss how to mobilize political action, ensure healthier and more sustainable societies and stronger economies. Throughout the next 2 days, and in many and numerous panels and fireside chats, we will hear from 70 plus speakers, culminating in a call to action to G20 leaders, health and finance ministers. Day one today will focus mainly on sustainable financing for health, and tomorrow, day two, will zoom in on other pressing global health issues, as well as the very pertinent and timely subject matter of health in the digital age. This year's summit aims to create positive interdependencies by bringing in a new age of health multilateralism, partnerships, and equity. And let me say that this is actually one of the very first big summits held here at the WHO headquarters right after the pandemic, emphasizing the relevance and importance of today's meeting, a meeting that could not have been possible without our summit hosts, of course, which I'm now more than happy to convey the word to. First up, he is the chair of the G20 Health and Development Partnership, and the person who's bringing all these amazing stakeholders together here and making the two-day conference a great success. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our host of the summit, Alan Donnelly.
I should tell you that Ali this week interviewed President Zelensky and Sir Tony Blair, so we're in very good company today, having him as our moderator. Dr. Tedros, Baroness Scotland, Professor Thabrani, Your Excellencies, and dear partners and friends, I'd like to welcome you to the 6th annual H20 Summit. And it's so wonderful to see you all in person, because it's been very difficult over the last 2.5 years with our H20 meetings being held virtually, but you've stuck with us, and I want to thank you for that. I also want to thank my dear friend, Dr. Tedros, for hosting the summit here at the World Health Organization headquarters. We very much appreciate, Dr. Tedros, your not just hosting us, but your encouragement and the many opportunities I have to talk to you. And I also want to mention the incredible support of the WHO staff that we've had at just organizing this event. And to all of you, you've been absolutely superb. So thank you very much indeed. We're also joined by Professor Hasbullah Thabrani, the chair of the Indonesian T20 Health Track. And I'm delighted, Hasbullah, that you're able to be here in person. And he and I, along with her teacher, Beaton, our executive director, met in Yogyakarta during the Health and Finance Ministers meeting. And we've struck up a very strong relationship between the H20 and the T20. And I'll be joining the T20 next week in Indonesia, where we'll continue to get some convergence between what you will agree this week and what the T20 will agree next week. And then we'll make representations to the health and finance ministers and the heads of government. So I'm very glad that you're here. The G20 Health and Development Partnership has played a significant role in supporting the Act A initiative over the last 2.5 years, including in helping to raise much needed funds for the tools to tackle COVID. And we've been very happy to help partners raise funds from around the world for the the absolute essential tools that were necessary to help save lives. And I think that the advocacy from the G20 Health and Development Partnership has also had a significant impact on health and finance ministers' declarations and on the impact on heads of government. And if you read the declarations from 2017 to today, finance ministers, first of all, now meet with health ministers, which was very much one of our initiatives, because frankly, health ministers don't really have the firepower without the support of health ministers. And so this partnership has been really important in helping to make sure that we've influenced the direction of travel when it comes to health and finance. And of course, what we've been able to do, I think, through our work is help countries mitigate both the human and the financial cost, where very, very vulnerable countries have needed help and support from multilateral institutions. And indeed, we've worked closely, Patricia, with you and the Commonwealth to try and help on that. The challenge now, of course, is for the G20, the G7, the World Health Organization, the Commonwealth and other multilateral institutions to consolidate the new public-private partnerships that have been created out of the global pandemic, and then build upon these foundations to ensure we have a global health architecture that is equitable and which is able to respond effectively and deploy sufficient resources in a systematic way to address the growing risk from new pathogens, antimicrobial resistance, sepsis, NCDs, while of course maintaining the essential fight against tuberculosis, malaria, HIV and AIDS, and NTDs. But you know, the political climate is changing, and you must be aware of this yourselves. And it's not changing in our favor. You can sense it when you meet finance ministers and when we've met some of the central bank governors. It's not changing in our favor. With soaring national budget deficits and energy prices, inflation, and a conflict that is impacting the food security of the most vulnerable, we need to redouble our efforts in the coming weeks and months to ensure that political leaders do not downgrade public health policy. And that's going to be one of, I think, one of our key themes over the next 2 days. We have to remind the political leaders that continued investment in health, research, innovation, product development, primary health care produces significant return for their citizens, but also for their economies. And you know from the work we've done in this partnership, we've produced many statistics that show what the return is on investing in health. And we've got to redouble our efforts to remind heads of government and finance ministers about that. Now, the H20 has been effective because we represent the not-for-profit organizations, academia, philanthropy, and the private sector. And we use that collective expertise, which is present in this room today, to produce practical and timely recommendations for political leaders. And what we've got to do in the next 2 days is we've got to do that. We don't want a shopping list for everything. We need to focus in on those critical things that we want the next round of ministerial meetings coming up in the next few weeks. And then as we go into the Indian G20 and the Japanese G7, we want a definitive list, a powerful list of things, not a shopping list, of things that can be delivered and where we can work together to help deliver that. So that's going to be our challenge over the next 2 days. So thank you all for being here at the WHO headquarters. And again, Dr. Tedros, thanks for allowing us to have this meeting here. I'd now like to hand over to our fantastic executive director, Hatice, who you all know, I mean, does an extraordinary job, as well as being the chief executive of Sovereign Strategy. She, in her not-for-profit work, is the executive director of this partnership. And Hatice, I just want to congratulate you and your team on a fantastic job in putting this together too. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alan. I will keep myself short. We have a lot of inspiring speakers here today. Dear Dr. Tedros, dear Baroness Scotland, and dear distinguished guests and excellencies, thank you for being here with us today. And I know some of you have traveled from all around the world to make it here today. And how liberating is it that we can finally have the freedom to travel. So let's appreciate that as well. The point I want to make in my intervention is I would like to take you through in 1 minute through the journey of this partnership and how we created it. The key thing is in 2016-17, we were sitting in a stuffy old pub with some of the partners here in the room, around 9 partners from across the global health community. And we were discussing how can we put SDG 3, the health SDG, and SDG 17 into action. And how can we make sure that the common global challenges that we work all together on in the global community, how can we leverage them higher up on G20 health and finance ministers' agendas? And I think fast forward 6 years later, here we are. We have now over 30 plus partners from across a broad spectrum, and even in a non-health space, we have economic institutions as well who have joined us. And we have over 25 global ambassadors, ex and current politicians, and movers and shakers in the health space. Finally, we have worked with over 6 G20 presidencies in different capacities, and our engagement groups, like with you, Professor Tabrani, we appreciate the collaboration. I think, as I said, what makes us unique is we offer this informal platform to all of our partners where everyone can raise their voice, and we find it is sometimes difficult to agree on a call to action before we send them to G20 leaders, but we find a common ground and the passion how we want to move and transform the health agenda going forward. In terms of health financing, this is one of our key mantras that we are pushing since 2018, how we can bring together health and finance ministers and make the case that health is a positive investment into the well-being of our societies and economies. And today, I'm very excited to hear further thoughts about how we will further develop ideas to close the funding gap in SDG 3. Unfortunately, it took a pandemic for leaders to realize the economic burden that health can impose on our societies and economies. But we are here now, and a lot of good progress has been pushed as well by the WHO, so thank you for that. Aligned with the theme of our event today, health, the new age of health and multilateral partnerships and equity, I urge everyone in the next 2 days to help us to further break the silos, come up with new innovative ideas, and think about not how we prevent the next pandemic, but transform systems change in a more sustainable fashion to prevent any future pandemic. Last but not least, I think one thing that the pandemic has showed us is that we have to include low and middle income countries and low income countries more into dialogue in future crisis management. And I would welcome to hear ideas how this can be, how this gap can be bridged for as a lesson learned from this pandemic. In terms of the, I'm sure you also, that's my final point, when you entered the building, the WHO has the tagline, health for all. I think my pledge to you is, let's do health with all, because all of you in this room are movers and shakers, and only with you we can change health together with you all. I encourage a candid, open, provocative discussion that our moderator will also facilitate. And at the end of day 2 of our event, there will be a call to action that we will display on the screen. We welcome your thoughts. We will revise these call to actions live. And we will ask you if you would like to endorse those, and these will be sent to the G20 and the G7. I would like to thank my great team and also the team at the WHO. They have been tirelessly helping us, and I look forward to the summit, and I look forward to the inspiring speeches. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And indeed, congratulations to both Alan and Hatice for pulling off a wonderful event here, packed with health experts from all over the world. Of course, Indonesia is holding the current G20 presidency. The T20, as we've just heard, will take place. And right after this conference, as a matter of fact, in Bali, many of you, I guess, will be there in person. Unfortunately, the Minister of Health, Indonesian Minister of Health, could not be here in person, but he didn't want to miss the opportunity to address this distinguished audience nonetheless. And he was kind enough to send us a greeting. Let's have a look.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, in 1994, following the two world wars, the world's leaders gathered in Bretton Woods in the spirit of solidarity and cooperation and established the World Bank and the IMF. The two global financial institutions now serve as the main pillars of our global finance architecture, which turned the devastations of the wars into the modern civilizations we live in today. And today, humanity is facing a different kind of war, a war against pathogens. COVID-19 pandemic has become the most prominent challenge since the two world wars. Until today, we have lost over 6.4 million lives, and more than 600 million people have fallen ill due to COVID-19. There was a time when the COVID-19 set us apart and exploited our weaknesses. Today, we must come together as a global community to work together and raise higher beyond this crisis. As we live in an interconnected world where risks are interconnected, so are the solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, to strengthen our global health architecture, no single entity can do this alone. Together, we must improve our capacities in health system, preparedness, and response to public health crisis. It takes countries, international organizations, multilateral agencies, civil society, and private sectors participation around the world. As Indonesia assumes the G20 presidency this year, we are committed to strengthening the global health architecture through multilateral and collaborative partnerships. We therefore taken proactive measures to engage G20 member countries and international organizations to support us in strengthening global health architecture through, first, building a global health system resilience. The world citizens are now looking at the leaders and expecting us to better deal with the next pandemic by synergizing financial and essential health resource mobilization and enhancing global health surveillance. Together, we must enhance our capacities to prevent, prepare, detect, and respond to pandemics in a highly coordinated manner. Second, harmonizing global health protocol standards. Problems of modern times require innovative solutions. We need a comprehensive health protocol standard to safeguard the world from future disease outbreaks. If a health crisis happens, we need to harmonize global health protocol standard in international travel to allow mobility for essential goods and services so that we could recover swiftly by enabling digital applications to mutually recognize health information systems for cross-border mobility. Third, expanding global manufacturing and research hub for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. The world demands new ways of thinking about the health system, and we should not put our eggs only in one basket. We therefore need to expand the global manufacturing capacities of health products, particularly for vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostic, and personal protective equipment. Together, we need to better streamline the essential countermeasure supply chain and to protect them to reinforce health system resiliency globally. Ladies and gentlemen, a strong partnerships of the G20 members with greater involvement of invited countries, international organizations, and all stakeholders will pave effective global health cooperation and sustainable financing for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response is the key to addressing the current global health security gaps and helping us be better prepared for future health crises. Today, I'm pleased to share with you that under the Indonesian presidency of G20, we have been making great strides in these directions by establishing the Financial Intermediary Fund for this purpose. This funding mechanism will be housed at the World Bank and will be guided by the central role of the World Health Organizations. Indeed, there are more to do to meet the funding target. Yet we are optimistic that as long as we stand together in this noble cause, we are on track to meet our target. Ladies and gentlemen, our collective effort to financing to pandemic preparedness, prevention, and response will count only for little if the access and provision to medical countermeasures that are vital during emergency response remain inequitable. Expanding manufacturing and research hubs to support pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response must constitute an integral part of our global strategy in dealing with future health crises. To this end, through our G20 presidency, we have made every effort to ensure that the diversified research and the manufacturing capacity in medical countermeasures could be accelerated and achieved. This is particularly important to ensure timely and equitable access to vaccine, therapeutics, and diagnostics, which prove indispensable during public health emergencies, especially in low and middle income countries. Ladies and gentlemen, the pandemic has been a tough crisis for all of us. But in the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity. This pandemic has been a tough crisis for all of us. But in the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity. Let us recover together and let us recover stronger. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much to the Indonesian Minister of Health, Budi Sadikin, for taking time out of his very busy schedule these days to record this message, for his words very much heeded. He, as we said, unfortunately couldn't be here, but the person who is here with us, thankfully all the way from Jakarta, is the lead co-chair of the T20 Global Health Security and COVID-19 Task Force, Hasbullah Tabrani, who, even though the T20 is just a few days away, did not want to pass up the opportunity to be here in person. Mr. Tabrani, welcome to Geneva. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Alan, and Dr. Tedros, and all of you who are here. It is a great pleasure for us to attend this meeting, to share what we are doing in Indonesia as T20, Think Tank 20, is an independent platform for supporting our government in the coming G20 meeting. Our president, as the presidency, take the theme for this is recover together, recover stronger, meaning that we are no longer in silo. doing recovering from this COVID-19. Everybody knows that this COVID pandemic has demonstrated to us the correlation, interdependency between health and economy. In the past, we rarely have that kind of evidence of the interdependency. And this COVID-19 is a wake-up call for everybody in the world that we have to be prepared if that's something happening. We don't expect that one, but when it is happening, we have to be prepared. And therefore, I think this summit will be very important for us to share, to review, to see, and to recommend for doable action for the G20 and prepare for the future. If after World War II, which affected many of the world, and COVID affect more countries than that, after World War II, the world create United Nations. Get up with United Nations. We have a wake-up call of the pandemic, but we shouldn't stop with wake up. We have to get up something and create something similar to ensure that sustainable financing, sustainable health system. And therefore, one of the first priority in our G20 presidency is the global health architecture recovering. But it is also now facing challenge after the war, Russia, Ukrainian, and inflation, stagflation. The attention of this reform might be deviated to others because the health sector's causal relationships takes longer and people often short-sighted, while those inflation, price, and so on are there every day and respond can be quickly. So this is our challenge. Hopefully during this 2 days meeting, we can solve, we can find a solution and recommend. Thank you very much, Alan, and all of team. Thank you.
So thank you indeed to Hasbullah Tabrani, the lead co-chair of the T20 Global Health Security and COVID-19 Task Force. And best of luck to you, of course, for the upcoming T20 conference in Bali. It's been said before, this is one of the very first big summits held here at the WHO headquarters in Geneva. As a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, this is the first official non-WHO conference being held here after the pandemic in this new building. And it is, of course, due to the hospitality of our next speaker, a speaker who was primarily known to the health community in the beginning, but certainly throughout the pandemic has become a globally known face, globally recognized name, and the symbol, if you will, of the global health community throughout the past 2 years. I've had the pleasure of announcing him numerous times at various conferences, but never here in his living room. So I'm extremely delighted to call upon the Director General of the WHO, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus. The floor is yours.
I was told that if you're the host, then you have to be standing to speak to your guests. So that's why I'm speaking from here. Thank you, Ali, and very nice to meet you again. Your Excellency, Minister Budi, I wish you were with us today, but I fully understand. Secretary General Patricia Scotland, Chair Alan Donnelly, Dame Angela Eagle, Professor Tabrani, and Felipe Denton. And I can see my friend, Senior Minister Thurman, also on the screen front of me. Thank you for joining, Thurman. Honorable Ministers, Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends, all protocols observed. It's my honor and privilege to welcome you all in person and virtually to the WHO headquarters for the annual H20 Summit. I would like to begin by thanking my good friend Alan for his continued leadership of the H20 Summit and for his tireless advocacy for health in the agenda of the G20, as we all know. We very much appreciate your work and I assure you of our continued support. I would also like to recognize the effective leadership of Indonesia, getting clear outcomes like the establishment of FIF, among others. And thank you to Indonesia, starting from President Widodo, Minister Budi, Finance Minister, the Foreign Minister, and others for their leadership. For the last 5 years, the G20 Health and Development Partnerships H20 Summit has brought together global health thought leaders and stakeholders from around the world and across health and finance and other sectors. The H20 support and advocacy for demonstrating the link between the health of populations and economies is helping to influence the narrative in G20 and G7 discussions. Rather than referring to health as a cost, it's now often seen as an investment. Of course, we have to do more. I'm grateful to the H20 for its important role in raising awareness, particularly in finance ministers, that there is a significant return on strategic investments in health, research, and improving access. As we have all experienced, the COVID-19 pandemic has been far more than a health crisis. It has deepened economic, social, and health inequities in all countries. Already vulnerable groups suffered the most. We now face many concurrent challenges. I think Alan had listed them all earlier. Conflict and humanitarian crisis, deepening poverty, rising food and energy prices, drought, famine, climate change, and political division. The pandemic has made clear that health is central to development. In the face of these many challenges, we must support countries to move forward on the path to universal health coverage and other health-related targets in the Sustainable Development Goals. Current progress is a quarter of that required to achieve the SDGs by 2030. Urgent action is needed to support countries to address these major health challenges and strengthen global health security. To meet these global challenges, WHO is implementing 5 strategic shifts in our work to support countries. First, promoting health by addressing the root causes of disease and creating the conditions for good health and well-being through multi-sectoral collaboration, for example, by enhancing gender equality and addressing air pollution and climate change. Second, providing health by reorienting health systems towards primary health care at the foundation of universal health coverage. Third, protecting health by strengthening the global architecture for health emergency preparedness and response, including a new legally binding international accord and a new financial intermediary fund. And as I said earlier, I thank Indonesia for its leadership on the fifth under its G20 presidency. Fourth, powering health through science, research, innovation, data, and digital technologies. The future is digital. And fifth, performing and partnering for health by building a stronger WHO as the leading and directing authority on global health at the center of the global health architecture. I'm glad to see that your program for the next 2 days includes many of these challenges and provide valuable contributions for policy discussions at the highest level. I'm glad to see that we're aligned on those issues. Thank you all for your commitment to multilateralism, partnership, and equity, and to a healthier, safer, fairer world. I wish you all fruitful discussions and a very successful meeting. I thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your words, Dr. Tedros, for your hospitality, and for your leadership. These next 2 days are going to be quite packed with fireside chats and panels, so let's get started right away. For those who want to share information and tweet about this information, the hashtag is H20 Summit, simple enough. For the very first fireside chats, we're now being joined live from Singapore. We're joined by the Senior Minister and Coordinating Minister for Social Policies in Singapore, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam. A pleasure to have you with us, Senior Minister. Thank you for joining us. We would have loved to have you obviously amongst us, but delighted that you're joining us virtually nonetheless. You probably heard that this year's summit is aiming to create positive interdependencies by ringing in a new age of health, multilateralism, partnerships, and equity. And let me ask you, as somebody who's extremely experienced in that field, how exactly, how concretely can we create these positive interdependencies of the many global initiatives that are out there based on your experience? What has worked? What are the best practices?
Thanks, Ali. And I'd like to thank Alan for inviting me to join you, and thank Dr. Tedros, whose leadership in this whole crisis has been invaluable. I would just say that, there's some things that are positive coming out of COVID in terms of the way in which public policy is recognizing better the science and the criticality of science and data. Dr. Tedros spoke about how health has to be powered by science and data. Public policy broadly has to follow the science. And politics has to follow the science. If politics is to be about the public interest within our own countries and globally, it has to follow the science. Not everyone in a population is going to be following the science, is going to be understanding all the complex interdependencies, but giving people a sense that what's happening in our own countries is related to what's happening around the world. What's happening in health is related to global warming, related to the loss of biodiversity and deforestation, giving people a broad sense of that. Developing political understanding in our societies that we cannot address issues piecemeal. We've got to address them systematically, and we have to address them globally, not just within our own countries, and to expect that we solve problems that way. So the awareness of something called the global commons is now stronger as a result of COVID. And likewise, I would say the extreme weather events that we're seeing, the extraordinary heat waves and floods that we're seeing, is also, I think, seeping into the body politic, that awareness that there is such a thing as the global commons. There is such a thing as climate change and global warming, and it's interacting, not just causing economic damage, it's interacting with the fact that we're now more vulnerable to future pandemics. So we've got to develop that understanding step by step. We've got to develop that understanding amongst a significant proportion of our populations. And the most important issue is what has been mentioned, and Dr. Tedros highlighted this. Investing in preparedness, investing in health, preparedness in particular, is not a cost. And it also means, therefore, that when we contribute to global efforts for prevention and preparedness, it's not about aid, it's about co-investment. It's about pooling together resources globally to strengthen the global commons within individual countries, regionally, as well as to strengthen our resilience through global preparedness. It's about co-investment, not about aid. And co-investment that is in each country's self-interest, quite apart from being in the interest of humanity. So I think there is a sea change in understanding that is coming about because of COVID. We've got to build on that understanding and not go back to our old ways as COVID eventually begins to fade or become endemic. We have to build on that understanding.
Cooperation, collaboration here, ultimately the key. Thank you for pointing that out, Minister. As part of your role in the high-level panel on pandemic preparedness and response, you have helped the G20 establish a new financing architecture on the lessons learned, based on the lessons learned. So what are some of those lessons you could share with us today? And more importantly, how to implement these lessons moving forward?
Well, I think the G20 under Indonesia's leadership, building on Italy's leadership last year, has really achieved something significant. The setting up of the Financial Intermediary Fund, a bit of a technical name, I think we need a simpler name for this, in a year where we've had many problems in the world, is a real achievement. And I really want to credit Indonesia's leadership, building on Italy's leadership, for having made this possible. It is a good start. It is not victory. It is a good start. Setting up a new pandemic preparedness fund, mobilizing more than $1 billion already from about 15 countries, both developed and developing. It's a good start, but we now have to go much further. We have to recognize the scale of the challenge we face. Pandemics are coming. The pathogens are coming. It may be a virus, it may be a bacteria, but the pathogens are coming. And each time it comes, it inflicts huge cost, immense cost, economically, but more importantly, to human lives. And we now have to accept that we have to invest at a higher level continuously over a long period of time to be able to avoid this happening again and again. And the investments required are a tiny fraction of the cost when a COVID scale pandemic comes. And the COVID pandemic may not be anything near the worst that could come. It may not be anything near the worst in future pandemics. So let's have a sense of scale, a sense of reality, and a sense of financial responsibility, that by putting in this money as a form of insurance, we're helping to prevent the same happening over and over again. And I think if we don't do it, we don't replenish this new fund, if we don't fund the whole system better, we'll really be repeating the scandalous failure of the last 2 years, the lack of preparedness in the global system. It's important to get going with using this initial fund, a significant achievement, mobilizing $1 billion so quickly. Start putting it to good use, building up in particular surveillance capabilities, particularly in the low and lower middle income countries. Half of the world's countries lack access to basic diagnostics. We are really at risk. And this is not just diagnostics with regard to future viruses, but bacteria-based diseases as well, which are equally likely to cause future epidemics. So building up surveillance has to be a very early priority, and we have to put full effort into it. We also have to fund the WHO better. It is underfunded. It needs reform. That's well accepted. But the WHO is not a broken organization. Every international organization needs reform, but they're not broken organizations. They need continuous improvement. And we shouldn't use governance reforms as an excuse. Delay stronger, persistent, and predictable funding for the WHO. But there are other greatly underfunded areas in global health preparedness, health security preparedness. R&D is underfunded. We have to invest now in developing the prototype vaccines for the 30 or so viral families that have the potential of causing human-to-human transmission and future epidemics. We have to develop those prototype vaccines now. We have to develop new drugs to counter antimicrobial resistance, AMR. And I'm glad that the call for action that H20 is proposing highlights the criticality of addressing AMR, which is already a quiet pandemic happening year after year. So we have to invest much more in R&D. And finally, we have to invest, as Budi Sadikin mentioned earlier on, we have to invest in a network of manufacturing capacities around the world, critically, because the next time a pandemic comes, even with the remarkable speed with which vaccines were developed this time round, it still took a long time to scale it up and to deliver it around the world, to deliver vaccines around the world with the required speed. We can't even wait 6 or 7 months because the cost is enormous. We've got to shorten that timeline, and the only way we can shorten that timeline is having in advance a network of manufacturing facilities with some risk diversification there, because we're not sure which virus it will be or which pathogen it will be, which platform is going to work. So we've got to diversify across the system and have it operate as a network, not just each facility belonging to each country. And that is a critical global public policy challenge that we must address. So let me just stop there. The scale of the challenge is large. We must recognize that it's in all our interest to co-invest in addressing this challenge. It is affordable, and the cost of not doing so is far, far, far larger.
The scale of the challenge is vast, but it is doable, says Minister Shanmugaratnam. And the words about the WHO certainly struck a chord with Dr. Tedros, who was listening very carefully and nodding while you were speaking. Now, of course, the pandemic has put the issue of health in the limelight and brought it in attention, probably unprecedented. And that has led G20 to create a stronger partnership between health and finance ministers. But let's be honest, the news cycle is very volatile, is very fast. Now the focus is on a war in Ukraine. The cost of living is going to be a big issue, inflation, and so on and so forth. How do you keep the issue of health on the agenda? How do you help the people in charge continue making it a priority?
Well, first, I think it's, I recognize, as Alan said at the very start, I think, that the politics or the political climate has not been conducive to addressing these issues boldly. But I would say we've got to use this crisis to improve politics. We've got to use this crisis to improve politics wherever we are around the world. The fact is, if you're talking about finance ministers, it would be financially reckless to not invest now and invest continually to build up preparedness for future pandemics. It'll be financially reckless. And every finance minister, I mean, the bottom line is try and avoid being reckless, try and do something that is at least broadly responsible. And it would be reckless to not invest now to prevent countries from having to face such tremendous cost the next time round. How much does it cost? The high-level independent panel that I co-chaired said that minimally, it requires $15 billion a year. That sounds like a large sum. It's actually a tiny sum compared to the cost of a pandemic. Everyone knows that. If you have to think of it in terms of our own budgets or our own GDPs within all our countries, the cost of building up the financial intermediary fund to the $10 billion a year required, which is critical. Build on this good start of $1 billion plus, scale it up, replenish it annually, but it's got to get to $10 billion. How much does that cost? It costs about 0.02% of GDP for most countries. And at most, for one or two countries, it's about 0.04% of GDP. 0.02% of GDP. In other words, 1/5,000th of GDP. Surely we can afford that. To not invest that amount, not pool our resources globally to develop greater preparedness across the system, it's just reckless. We're waiting for the next pandemic to come. It's worse than not buying insurance before you drive. This is like not buying insurance before you know you're going to have an accident. The accidents are coming. So let's be responsible, be financially prudent, and start investing in advance and not thinking it's bad politics. It's good politics when we serve the interests of our own populations.
Minister, you've been most generous with your time, and thank you for your valuable input. Before I let you go, and this is going to be a running theme throughout the next 2 days, I'm going to ask all our speakers to end with one or two very concrete recommendations that you would have to G20 health and finance ministers, and as a matter of fact, to the global health community here in this room, maybe in a couple of minutes. What are those recommendations that you want to depart with here?
I think we have to strengthen governance of finance and health together. The WHO remains the center for decision-making on global health. We do not have a natural fora to bring finance and health ministers together, and we have to strengthen that. And in that regard, let's avoid the perfect being the enemy of the good. Let's move forward. Use the G20, but it has to be G20 plus, a more inclusive version. Bring together countries that are not G20 members, but are capable of contributing actively. Bring together the civil society organizations. Bring together the global health organizations. Have the WHO at the center of it. But we've got to get moving and not be obsessed by institutional rivalries, not be obsessed by the broader geopolitics of the day, because this is in everyone's interests. It's in everyone's interest. Move ahead with the governance structure and improve it over time. It will complement the work of the Financial Intermediary Fund, but we've got to get going now in strengthening governance of finance for health, because we have to invest at a much higher level continually in global health preparedness.
Singapore Senior Minister and Coordinating Minister for Social Policy, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, thank you so much for your time, for your input, your wisdom, and for taking the time to speak to us today. This is your applause. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, that was our first of many more fireside chats to come. And now we move to our first panel, the first of many more throughout the next 2 days. It is titled the G20 Joint Health and Finance Task Force, a policy model to promote a new era of health financing in G20, ? And that first panel will be chaired by the chairman of the G20 HDP, Alan Donnelly. Alan, the word is yours.
All right, Ali, thank you so much. And I think this panel follows on very effectively from what we've just heard from the senior minister in Singapore. And I'd like to welcome the guests who are going to participate in this round table. Professor Hasbullah, of course, will make an introduction. You already know him. We have Dietrich Domanski, who's the Secretary General of the Financial Stability Board. Dietrich, thank you so much for joining us. And given what Tharman has just said, we do know that the Financial Stability Board, until the crisis in 2008, 2009, was known as the Financial Stability Forum, I think, and then evolved into the Financial Stability Board. So we're very interested to see if there's some lessons to be learned here in the health and finance sector. We've got Rachel Silverman Bonifield, the Policy Fellow at the Centre for Global Development, and CGD has done some excellent work in this area. So Rachel, you're very welcome to be here. And we've got Dame Angela Eagle MP, who was a Treasury Minister in Gordon Brown's government when the 2008 and 2009 financial crisis hit. She's now a global ambassador for the G20 Health and Development Partnership and also a member of the Treasury Select Committee. So what I'd like to do first is, I think I'm going to reverse these a little bit. I'm going to ask Dame Angela if she'd just like to make some comments, having heard what Tharman had to say, who's played such an important role in looking at what the financial architecture should be for health in the future. And given your experience of 2008 and 2009, and of course your work as our global ambassador, how should the architecture in this health space, the health and finance space, move forward?
Well, thank you very much for that, Alan, and particularly for the advance notice that you were going to do that. But I think that there are some lessons to be learned from what happened with the financial crisis, which perhaps Dietrich will also mention. In that case, we realized as the crisis escalated out of control that our surveillance mechanisms, which we had thought were fine for the situation in banking around the globe, were actually deeply flawed, and that we didn't have sight at all of what was coming down the track at us. In fact, we had a false sense of security from those AAA bonds that were sold around the world, containing the stuff that caused the problems. And nor did we anticipate or know at that time from the surveillance mechanisms we had in place precisely how far this contagion had gone. And so we were unsighted until the collapse was upon us. Therefore, Gordon Brown was coordinating the G20 at the time, and in my view did an absolutely fantastic job in extreme circumstances in getting the architecture for finance, which was in existence then, to evolve rapidly to deal with the crisis as it was upon us. But it wasn't subsequently evolved in the same way. There's had to be much work done to make sure that we are now far more sighted of what's going on in the banking world. That was almost like a virus, although obviously the ways of dealing with an actual virus are scientific and different. And it strikes me that our architecture at the moment is in a similar position to where we were during the financial crisis. We can only respond once, in the case of COVID-19, it had actually spread and it was already out and unstoppable. And therefore, what we've got to do is have a look to see how we can shift our systems, first of all, to much more transparency. You can't prevent anything if people hide it when it starts. So we have to have transparency of what's going on. We have to have proper ways of knowing where the problems are, and we have to have preventative measures ready to go, and investing in them upfront would save an enormous amount of money. So I think that there's a great deal to be learned from how the way the banking systems and the financial systems were changed and evolved in the aftermath of the financial crisis, which has direct relevance in the case of health.
Thanks very much, Angela. I'm actually now going to go to Rachel, because, as I've said, the Centre for Global Development has done some incredible work in this field. And where do you think, in terms of the Joint Health and Finance Task Force, and we've actually got Bruce Aylward sitting here, who's been a key member of this, but if we were going to learn the lessons from 2008, 2009, if we're going to learn the lessons from 2020 and 2021, where should this task force be going if we're going to do the things that Angela's talked about, which is surveillance, transparency, and rapid response?
Thank you very much, Alan. Well, I think we are in an apt forum right now, because I think the G20 really does have a very important role to play in this space. So why is that? So right now, the G20 is more or less the only international forum that is working, at least to some extent, where there are countries that are really participating. Where I don't mean to put the WHO in that category, but I mean a diplomatic forum for countries to discuss together and to have the conversations. It is one where China is continuing to participate. It is one where the United States is, and even Russia is still part of this for now. And that makes it a very unique space and a very valuable space. And they've already had an important victory, setting up the Financial Intermediary Fund, and having China participate in that as a funder is an incredible diplomatic achievement. Indonesia as well as a funder, extraordinary. So this is a huge piece of momentum to, and when it's important we use the space well, protect it, and keep that momentum going. I think the analogy between the Financial Stability Board, which I will hear much more about, and I certainly do not consider myself an expert on it, and the potential role of the task force are a little bit different. I think the FSB is very much focused on quasi-independent data analysis and oversight, that sort of forecasting role that you talked about, of seeing the things coming down the horizon and standard setting to prevent it. I'm not sure that we have exactly an analogous role to play in global health. I think our methods for predicting pandemic preparedness have not been great in performance on the COVID-19 pandemic. And the sort of apolitical technocratic secretariat that I think really strengthens the FSB, I'm not sure we exactly have an equivalent capability in global health that we could deploy in the same way. But one place that I think is a very important analogy between the two is the idea of stabilization. there's two ways to think about health and two important things we're looking to do in health. One is to improve health progressively over time. And that's, of course, what is done here at the WHO. But the other is a stabilization role, protecting against downside risk and shocks to health from wherever the baseline might be, which, in many places is not as high as it should. But that is a different role than health improvement, which is a gradual process that takes place over time. And I would argue that this is where the task force should focus, on this stabilization role. So what would that mean in practice? I think a mandate that is about reducing, mitigating, and responding to emergent health threats with potential cross-border implications. Again, it is not everything that matters in health. It is a subset that could potentially be handled in this kind of international institution. So what is this not in this vision? Well, it's not a body to remote UHC, health equity, or solidarity. Again, not to say these are not very important things, but I think if we want this to work as a forum, we need to keep it narrow, stabilization focused, and technocratic. It is not necessarily a general forum for cooperation on all health issues. We have many forums for cooperation on health issues, the WHO chief among them. It is not potentially, and also for standard setting and accountability, I think we have the WHO for this. And my earlier comment notwithstanding, I think they are the right institution, and I think they do a good job at these roles. So I don't think we want to have mission creep of this task force to everything that we already have international institutions doing and doing pretty well. And so I would very strongly urge the task force to remain in this narrow, relatively technical space. And part of this is politics. It's about full participation from countries with potentially challenging internal politics. I would count the United States, of which I am a citizen, as one of them. I think we need to be building something that is robust to potentially right-wing governments in Europe, to a future Republican administration in the United States, and have the kind of forum that is still palatable and useful to different kinds of audiences. So this is not going to be Gavi. It's not going to be the Global Fund. It's not going to be the WHO. We have these institutions already. They are useful and great at what they do, but this is not that. This needs to be narrowly focused on these sort of health security issues if it is going to work. And if it is perceived as an aid body at all, I think that is a very problematic thing, because then it will be first on the chopping block for cutting. I think this needs to be, let's be realistic about the politics here. We need to be smart about how we position this such that it is acceptable, it is well-funded, and robust to the changing winds that I think Alan already referenced in his introductory remarks. We even need to be very strategic about how we talk about this. I think that, they say Twitter is not real life. And I think we also have to recommend that, on some level, health advocates are not real life, in the sense that they are not representative of necessarily the kind of ruthless politics of all the domestic environments. I care personally about equity and multilateralism and justice. These are words that are important to me. I assure you, these will not resonate with potential future President Ron DeSantis of the United States. So we need to be strategic in even our use of language about how we present something that is broadly acceptable, that will be robust to many different political environments. And I think, the stabilization aspect is really key here. You can have countries with very different interests overall, like the USSR and US during the Cold War. You still want that telephone between the two countries to understand and de-escalate emergencies as they happen. And that's, I think, how we need to think about this role. It is that red telephone helping coordinate countries that are very large and powerful and have very different interests, but have one really important shared interest, which is avoiding another COVID-19 or worse pandemic. So what should this do? Well, I think another difference potentially from the FSB is that we should think about this as more of a transitional or governing body versus the implementing body itself. I think, again, this goes to the different roles that are required. Consolidating the Financial Intermediary Fund is, I'd say, its first step. This is already a massive diplomatic victory. They need to keep the pressure on G20 peers to follow through on their initial funding commitments and stay engaged in the steering and governance to make sure this is a success. I think the second big task here is the emergency and surge response function for future pandemics. Of course, there is the WHO's emergencies program, but what we are talking about, or what the, say, independent panel recommended, was a surge capability of $50 to $100 billion needed. And that is orders of magnitude above the resources currently available to the WHO. You could argue that that should be done under the auspices of the WHO, and I think it's a reasonable argument. But again, I think we need to be realistic about the politics. And for example, where is US money of that kind of magnitude going to go? And I think it's probably unrealistic to expect that that would be channeled through the WHO in the current political environment. And perhaps a sort of forum under the G20 focused on security and stabilization is a much more viable path to attract the kinds of resources we're talking about. So I'll pause there. I think, my big takeaway message is we need to be realistic about the politics, and the G20 is an extraordinary forum for this kind of cooperation. We have a really important opportunity right now, and we need to be very strategic about how we use it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rachel, for that. What I'm going to do again is just ask Hasbulla now, and then I'm going to bring in Dietrich to make a comment. But Hasbulla, one of the things that I've been picking up when, for example, we were in Yogyakarta for the Health and Finance Ministers meeting, is that there is some confusion about the funding mechanism, which is the point that we've just had from Rachel, of the Financial Intermediary Fund, which is a mechanism to fund pandemic preparedness, and then how in the future will health and finance ministers cooperate together. And I just wonder, given the fact that Indonesia has hosted health and finance ministers meetings, how do we make sure that people don't get mixed up between the development of the FIF and also the need to continue the meeting between health and finance ministers? Because my worry is that some finance ministers may say, okay, job done, we've got the FIF, we don't need to focus so much on health financing. So I just wonder, with all your experience, how do you think we, over the next few months for the rest of the presidency, can we make sure that there's no confusion here?
Thank you, Alan. Yes, I share your confusion. If the history saying that between Ministry of Health and Ministry of Finance always arguing, always debating on what to allocate and how much fund needed for the health sectors. That's been in the discussion for many, many years. Yeah, I see that the main problem is that both politicians, the ministries in different sectors, are not in the same page of what is it the pandemic, what is it the health investment. We have to understand the nature of the pandemic. This is a natural disaster, I would say. It is not man-made. It is naturally developed. We never expect, we don't know how virus evolve or reform to change the new strain and so on. Nobody can expect that one. So all of a sudden, we are confronting with this situation where the virus spreads so quickly and impacted economy. At that time, then we are aware. We need to invest something in that. But what I share with many others that the G20 already achieved great work, also with the WHO World Bank, to establish FIF. But we have to understand that the FIF is an intermediary fund to support preparedness. When you're talking, I read in your comment of the fund, the global fund, what is the future? It is not cover the treatment or the vaccine for all. We talk all of these equitable. What is equitable? Not many people think deeply on this. What we call it equitable, is it equitable if, for example, this current FIF supported by the, in my view, voluntary fund supported by countries. While Indonesia contributes 50 million US dollar, it's about 0.5% of our GDP. But some other countries might contribute less than 0.01% of the GDP for this fund. And depending on what fund will be used, is it equitable or not equitable? I'm thinking of the nature of this disaster, the COVID, as if as individual we are confronting of this disease and we never expect. And if we have to pay higher than 10%, this is the UHC indicator, 10% of our income for that, and the indicator said that we agree this is catastrophic. So now talking about the global fund, who will be at the higher risk of if, for example, 10 years from now, this kind of pandemics happening again? Are we ready? Which country are affected the most, and how much they have to contribute? So that's kind of a simulation that we have to think. It's about the fairness, not only the working or the agreement, consensus between Minister of Finance, Ministry of Health, but we have to have agreement that what if it's happening again 10 years from now, and how do we finance? Not only to prepare, because this FIF funding for the preparedness, capacity building of its country to prepare. Who will pay for the vaccine, for example, at this time? And then people blaming that, well, all high-income countries does not support the low-income countries getting less vaccinated. And well, that's the reality. If then less or low-income countries don't contribute at all, do they have the right to get this fund to use for that? So a lot of issues in the fairness or equitable financing, and then adequacy of financing remain unsolved in my view. And it is in greater risk with this war that maybe our attention deviates to this common consumption that might be easier to get commitment for more funding. So back to your questions, I think both Ministry of Health and Ministry of Finance in all countries have to understand, agree what will be the likely that this occur and who will be charging on. But that's only the public sector. The private sector also should contribute for that. How we mobilize, because the private sector, like company, corporation, also affected with this pandemic. They cannot produce, they are not productive, so they have to contribute also. How do they engage in that one? Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Now, I think there's been some really interesting points made, and I'm going to take some questions or points from the floor in a second. But what I want to first of all do is ask Dietrich, in his position as Secretary General of the Financial Stability Board, to talk about what oversight you had during the COVID crisis, because obviously you have finance ministers and central bank governors who meet. And I just want to remind everyone that I think one of the things Dr. Tedros set up was the Global Pandemic Monitoring Board. I think it was set up during your time as Director General. And a report was produced in the autumn of 2019, which said that the world was facing an imminent airborne pandemic. An imminent airborne pandemic. Now, we've met with the UN Secretary General. We asked him whether the UN discussed that report. He said no. We've asked finance ministers if they took any notice of the report. And there does seem to be a big disconnect between these important scientific reports, which subsequently were proved right and have had a devastating impact on the world economy, and the response, the mechanisms for response. So Dietrich, with my comment on that, I know you've produced reports on the outcome of COVID and so forth. I mean, what lessons are there to learn, and perhaps which the WHO and others sitting around here can take back to the task force to try and strengthen the role that they're playing?
Yeah, thank you, Alan, and thanks a lot for having me here today. It's really a great pleasure to share an FSB perspective, or bring an FSB perspective to this very important discussion. Before I turn to your specific question about our experience during COVID, let me just briefly recall, for the benefit of those who may not be so familiar with the FSB, how it came about. FSB was established, as Angela said, by G20 leaders in 2009 following the London summit, with a very clear agenda to coordinate a comprehensive financial reform agenda in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. So this clear agenda, strong commitment by all G20 countries around the table to tackle the fault lines from the crisis, created strong tailwinds in the initial years for the FSB process. I think this is very important to recognize. What has been encouraging, and I'm just foreshadowing this for a couple of points that I'm going to make later, what has been encouraging, that subsequently the FSB has been able to prove its effectiveness as a body for international work on global financial stability, pretty much over the past decade, in I think more instances than we would have liked to see, including times of significant headwinds to international cooperation. I think this is quite interesting and relevant. Now, turning to the COVID experience, I think the COVID experience from an FSB perspective, first and foremost, showed the value of having structures, processes, mechanisms for monitoring, information exchange, analysis, and discussion in place. Because what we could do right from day one of the pandemic and the associated financial market turmoil was to set up a mechanism for exchanging information on policy measures, financial policy measures taken by our member jurisdictions. And this was quite a heavy exercise. And one of our members described it as a fire hose of information that we were providing to members. I think in the early days, it was almost hundreds of measures that we provided information on every day. We also could set up very quickly, within a few days, actually a monitoring mechanism to assess financial stability implications of the COVID pandemic, focusing on a couple of critical nodes in the global financial system. That was possible because we could draw on the technical abilities in the Secretariat, but also in our member institutions. And then we could quickly turn into policy discussions. What are we doing? What are we seeing? What are we learning on the fly, essentially, about the effectiveness of our measures? Where is a need for coordination? So that was really the sort of short-term action, which then found its way into various reports to the G20. We produced a couple of updates. I think it were 4 updates on COVID developments and the implications for the global financial system. The Italian G20 presidency asked us to prepare in 2019 a dedicated report, sorry, 2020, a dedicated report, no, 2021, 2021, sorry, 2019, 2021, a dedicated report on policy lessons learned from the COVID pandemic from a global financial stability perspective, including questions of what has worked in terms of the regulatory framework, what hasn't worked. This year, 2022, our Indonesian friends have asked us to work on questions around exit from COVID measures, in environment of a desynchronized global recovery. What does it mean in terms of policy unwinding, spillovers, and how to prevent longer lasting scarring effects on economies? So quite a lot of experience, I think, to draw on from COVID. Let me come back to my headwind example. I think the more remarkable feature about, well, not more remarkable, but one remarkable feature about the FSB process and its robustness is, for instance, its ability to continue work on the financial implications of climate change in the late 2010s, right? A period of headwinds in a number of respects. So I think this shows that what I think is the essence of the success of a process, a cooperative process like the one of the FSB, the commitment of members is something that develops dynamically in light of what you actually do, your performance track, if you like. And with a performance track, I think the willingness to keep engaged, even on topics that may be more difficult for whatever reason, increases. So probably already spoken for too long. So let me just highlight, if you take this point that commitment of members is the key for success of a cooperative body over the longer run, let me just very briefly highlight 4 points that I think are critical to get that commitment, or in the FSB case, to have had that commitment for more than a year. First is a robust mandate. We have a mandate that is focused on financial stability, but within this area, we cover the whole policy cycle. So we are not asked to say, okay, you focus on policy implementation, say. We have a mandate for surveillance, for policy development, and for policy implementation, and also for evaluating how the policies actually work. So this prevents mission creep and helps to concentrate work on technical aspects and helps to avoid unnecessary politicization of discussions. Second point is our broad and senior membership. We bring to the FSB table those authorities that are in charge of financial stability policy in the major financial systems, internationally in the form of international organizations, IMF, OECD, World Bank, and also the sectoral standard setting bodies. We bring these together at a senior level, at a decision maker level, so people can speak for their authorities, and they can marshal resources to do work, and they can make commitments for cooperation and actual actions. Third point, the FSB is a member-led process, and member-led process means that our members have full ownership of the agenda and the process. And I think an important part of that is that we are a very small organization. We have a secretariat in Basel of just 36 people that supports our whole process. In addition to making sure that we operate efficiently, I think it prevents a perception that there is a big shadow bureaucracy somewhere, in Basel in this case, that essentially runs the process. This is not the case, and this is something that gives great confidence to our members. Yeah, I said senior representation, that is very important, both at the individual member level, including advanced economies and emerging markets, and IOs and standard setting bodies. My main message is our experiences from the FSB are certainly not one-to-one transferable to the health finance space. I think this would be naive to believe that, and Raquel has mentioned a couple of aspects here that are important. However, I think there are important commonalities, and this is sort of the one fundamental commonality is the need for member commitment, and that would be my message, that it is an important task to develop a clear understanding what members want, what can be done to create and keep momentum, develop momentum and keep momentum for such commitment, and get the process going on this basis. And I would agree with Tarman that a perfect governance may not be what is needed to begin with. The FSB has also gone through a number of governance adjustments over time. I think once become a clearer sense of what exactly the objectives, the focus, the processes are, I think making then these adjustments is something that shouldn't be too difficult. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Very interesting, Dietrich. Now I'm going to take the first question, which is from Philippe Dunaton from Unity. Philippe, you had a question or a point you wanted to make. If you can just wave at me if you want to put a question or make a point to the panel.
Thank you, Alan, and thanks for the presentation and all the point that was made, and of course the setting set by Dr. Tedros. More than a question, I think it's more an observation linked with the comments made from the finance perspective and also what was said about the lesson that we have learned through the pandemic of COVID. And of course, it has consequences because financial mechanisms should be also articulated with some kind of clear priorities. And I don't want to say that I can present the lesson we've learned all together, by the way, with Tedros, with my colleague and friend from the Hub, Bruce, and all the head of agencies that are closely working together under ACTA. But I think that in terms of thinking about how the finance should be used and articulate with that experience, one point I want to make is the importance of access to innovation. I think it's obvious, but I think this is a lot of consequences. I take your point from what does mean equitable. I think that we need to be simple. I think that the people in need, whether they are living in the South or in the South, should be have access to innovation they need at the same time. That's the goal. For me, it's a very clear definition. But it has consequences. It has consequences in terms of thinking about continental production. I don't like local production. It has to be at the size of the continent. This is the setting in terms of quality, volumes, and price. So in terms of access, I think it's absolutely key that in the thinking of the finance, this dimension, and I know Dr. Taylor is pushing the platform, we support that, it's very important. But I think that it has to be in the head of the Minister of Finance, because it's not just health, it's also production, industry, and I think it's absolutely key. Pushing also the pharma industry to open the rooms to develop generic. Of course, we need industry to develop new drugs, but also we need to find agreement with industry to make sure that, again, if we want people to have access at the same time, there are the decisions made. 2 points, again, linked with what we learned, but it's a collective thing. I mean, there is a need to be really more inclusive with the work with countries, all the countries, including countries in the South, and also on a specific point, which is not just the pandemic response, on how to include the communities, because the model of care on the day-to-day basis is very important, but we have seen the resilience and the pertinence of this model also in the fight for the pandemics. And the last point, again, it's a question, it's a reflection in terms of finance. I can see a lot of discussion between preparedness and response. And to be honest, I'm really afraid of that. I think that we need to think about the continuum, because we cannot take the risk to have, of course, the work done in preparedness without clear links with the response. In my view, and I will not be too much specific, but I think it's a big lesson we have learned collectively. We need to prepare the response as well as the preparedness. One of the examples, my colleague Willow is here for fine, we need diagnostic for the surveillance. But the diagnostic for surveillance should be connected with the response in terms of access to care. I can have many examples of that. And I think that if we want to reduce, minimize the gap, the delay of the response, we need to include the response at the level of preparedness. So again, this is my thought. I mean, it's more remarks than question, but I think I will be happy that if the people who are thinking in terms of the finance, which is absolutely key, may have that kind of point in head moving forward. So Thank you so much, Alan. And
Philippe, thanks very much, and thank you for the leadership role you played in the therapeutics pillar in the ACT Accelerator, which was very important. Since we've got Bruce Aylward here, who has been working with the Health and Finance Task Force, and given what Dietrich has said, Bruce, have you got any reflections on where you think this relationship between health and finance ministers might go, and whether it could be through a strengthened task force? And then I'm going to give Dietrich advance notice of another question, which is, if the body I mentioned before, and I don't know whether it still exists actually, but the Global Pandemic Monitoring Board was to produce another report which identified an imminent pandemic, risk of pandemic, would you welcome that coming to the Financial Stability Board from the World Health Organization, so that you could take it to the finance ministers and central bank governors? So I'll give you time to think about that one. Bruce, any reflections?
Thank you, Alan. I'd first just like to thank the speakers for what I thought were incredibly insightful and helpful guidance, because we're at a point, and for those of you who don't know the many titles I wear, one of them the Director General's asked me to take on was the head of the Secretariat to the G20 Task Force. So I've been in a position of trying to steer that for much of the last year, or support that process. And we're right now at a point where many folk think of the task force as really an experiment, something that was established really for a very short period to help bring forward the consensus about the FIF and get the FIF up and operating, as we'll talk about in the next session. However, it's also recognized at the same time, as Tarman and other speakers just commented on, this collaboration has frankly been a game changer between finance and health in our ability to manage the current pandemic to a certain degree, but I think the promise of better management of future pandemics to a much, much greater degree. So the big question right now, of course, is where do you go with the task force? And that's why this conversation has been really helpful. A lot of concern about the point you raised, Rachel, mission creep, whose mandate, and really staying at that intersection of finance and health on this issue of PPR, and not creeping, as you said, Dietrich, into other areas, as the FSB has amazingly managed to do in terms of its remit. So what we're looking at right now is, should the task force continue? Should it be expanded, make it more inclusive, while not losing the agility of how it currently sets up? How do you focus its mandate? So all of this, Alan, and to the speakers, has actually been great. More than food for thought, but sort of direction and lessons as we go forward. The task force met yesterday, actually, and had a long hour-and-a-half discussion on this specific issue of where they go next. Lot of interest, toes in the water, but a lot of questions as well about a commitment to a multi-year, approach of finance and health, and ensuring it's in the right space. So thanks for the input. And my big message from the next session, where unfortunately you'll have to hear from me again, will be stay engaged. And I think just the comments we've heard is just again highlighted the wisdom that fora like this bring together and the help. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Bruce. Dietrich, I gave you a minute there to have a little think about the question, and then I'll just ask for some any other reflections from Rachel, and then Angela.
So let me answer your question by saying a few words about the, if you like, analytical framework with which the FSB operates. May sound a bit arcane, but I think it's relevant to giving a meaningful answer to your question. So we think about risks to finance, or we think about financial instability as the end point of a sequence of things, right? You have a shock like a pandemic, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There are more than enough of these shocks, and these shocks then hit existing vulnerabilities in the financial system in the form of leverage, maturity mismatch, excessive risk taking, all kinds of things. And these vulnerabilities then interact with each other, spread through the system, and the end is financial instability, which we define as a distortion to the provision of finance to the real economy. Now, coming back to your question, the report that you are describing would be about a shock, right? And the likelihood of another shock.
The possibility of a headwind, a serious headwind.
The possibility of another shock. And I would say, well, if we were to put this to our members, they would say, oh, this is interesting, and maybe very interesting, depending on the report. And it will certainly influence our thinking about vulnerabilities and potentially assessments of financial stability risks going forward. So we use it as input for our assessment, but it's not our role to talk about shocks. We cannot predict shocks as financial stability authorities. That is not our role. So that's where, from our perspective, the buck would stop, if you like. Let me just add one point that came to my mind also when Bruce spoke. I think one general issue when collaborating on health and financial stability issues is the need to find common terminology and language. And so we've worked with a number of institutions during the pandemic on the question, of course, how does COVID affect COVID prevention measures and so on, affect financial stability outcomes. And this need to understand fully what your counterpart, if particularly if that person is not coming from financial stability background, is actually talking about is very important. And this is maybe also something to bear in mind on how to find, and I point here primarily to myself, I think financial stability discussions can be terribly jargonous, how to make sure that the other side really understands why the health side matters from a broader economic and financial stability perspective.
Dietrich, thank you very much. I mean, we'll send you a few reports on antimicrobial resistance and its risk, because I think that's the next one round the corner. Rachel and then Angela.
No, thank you to everyone for sharing these thoughts. I think a lot to chew on. You know, to the point just discussed, maybe that's where I'll end. I think one issue we have over and over again in the relationship between finance and health ministers, and in advocacy to the finance ministry at every level to try and increase resources for health, which is just a recurring theme across all of global health in every country, is that I don't think that finance ministers often see global health advocacy as very credible. It does not speak their language, as you say. They do not know what to say. I think maybe we should take a little bit of responsibility as a community ourselves for some not particularly defensible estimates that have been put forward to finance ministers over the year. Now, that said, COVID-19 was such a big financial shock that it's obvious you don't need to do the short-term advocacy to convince finance ministers it's a big deal. They're paying attention. I think that is the opening. But that communication, that speaking the same language, that talking in a way that is credible to people who are coming from a kind of technocratic perspective, who are not themselves necessarily health advocates, but are open to the idea that this impacts the economy. We need to be very careful about how we're credibly communicating to that audience. And I think in this case, it's an extraordinarily strong economic case, so it should be an easy case to make. Let's stick, to the facts and to, very, very defensible estimates of what's happening, and try and build that trust and relationship back a bit.
Thanks very much, Rachel. And I know that you're very much involved in trying to ensure that the language that's used can be understood across the board, not just by health specialists. Angela, the final word with you before we break for lunch.
I think that it's a complete shift in finance ministers' understanding of health to say it's an investment. I mean, that if you manage to get that radical shift in people's minds, you'll have already won most of the battle. And I think in the aftermath of COVID-19, it's so obviously true that that is really important. But I think also, I mean, I do agree with Rachel that you can't just then say, and therefore we have to have, 55 gazillion billion pounds immediately to have everything we want so we can do everything. I mean, I've been a Treasury Minister. I've had to go around and listen to other ministers telling me, we've done budgeting things, and it's like, yeah, but what are you gonna spend it on? How much of it are you gonna waste? And all of that stuff. So we all know what goes on. But I think that there are some themes that you can focus in on to reduce the ask. And I think, Rachel, you talked about some of the technocratic nature of it so that it can be robust, whatever political persuasion happens to be sat in the Treasury at the time. And clearly that's got to be surveillance. It's got to be funding early research on potential emerging pathogens. It's got to be trying to do something about antimicrobial resistance and the development of other means of treating diseases that are moving further away from being treated, by making an economic case for that. And there are the basic sinews of an overwhelming case that you can make if you make it properly. Don't just go in and say that, our health service now needs 55 gazillion billion pounds from now till whenever. It's 41% of health spending. 41% of GDP is going to be health spending in the UK by 2025. So you've got to get the balance right and be savvy. And so going for those things that need for them to be set up, for them to exist, for them to be effective, need future funding. You've got to go to things like developing early vaccines for obvious pathogens, dealing with the issues that are out there now, and having your surveillance systems in place so that you can react faster than we did this time. And that seems to me an overwhelmingly simple case to make.
Okay, thanks so much for that. I'm going to hand this back now to Ali. So Ali, you've got the floor.
Thank you so much, Alan. First of all, congratulations on a very wonderful panel. A lot of input that I think we received from the wonderful speakers, masterfully chaired. Thank you, Alan. Indeed, and ending on the dot, which is quite a challenge considering the 2 days that are fully packed, the schedule. So thank you so much for that. I think throughout this morning, we had a lot of food for thought, and I think we all deserve some actual food now to digest the many information and inputs that we have received. Looking to Hatice for 30 minutes, right? So 1:05, 1:10, we're going to be back here in this room, 1:05 perhaps, yeah. and then we're going to continue with a fireside chat with the Secretary General of the Commonwealth of Nations, Patricia Scotland. In the meantime, enjoy the food, enjoy the break, and we'll be back here 1:05. Thank you.